Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Rich, and you've turned into another episode of Wristwatch Rescue. Today on my bench, I've got this beautiful King Seiko from the late 1960s. I bought this off of eBay and planned to put it in my collection, but as I started wearing it around, it has some issues. So what we need to do is take this thing apart and discover what's causing the problems in this watch, give it a full service, and get it back on my wrist. This watch is a high beat watch. That means it beats 28,800 times an hour, whereas most watches only go 18 or 21,000. But what that gives you is a really smooth sweep seconds hand when you look at the watch. It's very similar to a quartz watch today. Now, I put this on the time grapher, and it looks really good on the time grapher. I mean, the amplitude, that's the AMP, is kind of low. But what I found is when I start looking at it, my hands are moving with the crown all the way in. That shouldn't be happening. So what I need to do is take this guy apart, find out what's going on with that keyless works, because it's got to be in there someplace, I got a feeling. So I'm going to use this bezel removing tool and gently squeeze that bezel off of there. Yeah, oh, there we go. And then I can take the crystal off. I'll just use my case back tool to get that crystal off. Now it's got a nice snug gasket in there. Now to get this watch apart, I have to bring it out through the front of the case. So I need to take the hands off first. Well, that's why I'm putting this piece of plastic over the dial, because this dial is beautiful and I don't want to scratch it. Good practice is to always protect the dial when you're removing the hands. Now, with the hands off, I can just simply put them in my little tray here. And now this guy has a fine-tune screw in the side. First you have to take this case screw out, and then you can put a screwdriver in there and fine-tune the watch balance. That saves you from having to remove the entire movement out of the case every time you want to tune it up. Now, I also have to take the stem out, and then this has got a ring in there that holds the movement, and you have to get in there and slide it real gently. Now, I'm using my steel tweezers because I don't want to use my brass tweezers on this, because this can tear up your tweezers pretty bad. Now, the watch just falls out. Now, this is an automatic watch. You can see the counterweight there flopping around on the back of the watch. And what that actually does is when you move your arm, it winds it up. It's kind of an ingenious method of doing things. But this watch can also be wound manually. Now, I've got the dial off, and it seems like this dial is original. I can see the 8 and NR on the back of the dial. So that tells me that dial was made at the same time or same year as the watch, which is good because that makes me feel better that nobody's been in here messing with this watch before I got it. Now, I use these little boxes for the dials, and I put the hands in there too. It keeps them from getting torn up, because sometimes I have to wait for parts for some of these watches in between the time you see me take this apart and I put it back together. Now, the other thing I want to do is another best practice thing is to take the balance off of the movement first thing, because what that does, it'll protect it. Now, this balance is very special. The reason it can go 28,800 is that hairspring is a lot beefier than a normal hairspring. And by being a heavier hairspring, it can go faster back and forth. Now, Seiko actually did make a 36,600 beats per hour watch. It was called the Lord Marvel. I have one of those in my collection. I love it, but I don't use it very much because they're prone to wear out a lot faster because they're beating so fast. But the seconds hand is the smoothest second hand I've ever seen on a mechanical watch. Seiko had 2 factories in Japan in the 1960s. CEO of Seiko pitted them against each other to see who could build a better watch. Now, one of the factories produced the Grand Seiko, This guy, the King Seiko, was produced in the other factory, and they shared ideas a little bit, but they tried to really outdo each other. And back in the 1960s and 1950s, there was actually a competition in Europe between watch manufacturers to see who could build the most accurate watch. And every year, the manufacturers would submit watches to the competition. Well, Seiko really came on in the early 1960s, and they, with the Grand Seiko and the King Seiko, they got closer and closer to winning that competition. And then, like 1966, they placed like fourth place. And then when the next one came around, the Swiss got real nervous and they canceled the competition. Nothing like changing the rules of the game when you need to. Now, the keyless works on this watch are really complicated. And I found this little spring, you see it there on the right, just below my tweezers. It was not pushing against part of the keyless works that it needed to. So hopefully when we put it back together, that'll work. This watch has what's known as 3 complications. In the watchmaking world, a complication is an additional feature that is added to the watch. This watch has a date complication, a automatic winding complication, and a quick set date complication. And the quick set complication was a premium feature. Very few watches in this price range had one of those features. And what it does is it lets you pull the crown out, the second click, turn the crown counterclockwise, and you can quickly set the date, as opposed to a watch that doesn't have that complication. You would need to move the minute hand and back and forth from about 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock to get the date to roll over. And that's very time consuming. So it was a really neat feature to have, and one of the first watches to have it. As I'm taking this ratchet wheel off of the bridge, I noticed that this watch, its crown wheel doesn't have a screw on top. And also, this watch has a jewel on the barrel arbor, not only on the top, but also on the bottom. So it's a premium watch. It has 25 jewels in all. This watch in 1968 retailed for about $110, which sounds really cheap today, but back then that would have been about $1,000 watch. But you can pick up one of these on eBay like I did for about $450 to $500. Seiko did not sell a whole lot of mechanical watches in the U.S. back in the 1960s. They got more popular in the 1970s, and they got really popular as the Seiko quartz watches came out. A lot of servicemen that went to Southeast Asia in the late 60s bought Seiko watches in the PXs and brought them home. And that's where a lot of Americans started discovering the Seiko brand and how good a watch it really is. Now, if you look at the escapement wheel, the teeth on the high beat watch, this has about 30% more teeth on that watch. So that pallet fork is going back and forth really, really fast. This watch uses this unusual winding wheel. So the automatic winder can get the power to the mainspring. Because what it does is when that oscillator wheel turns that we saw earlier, those two little wheels, depending on which way the oscillator wheel was going, would put the power directly to the mainspring. Now lastly, I'm removing the hack. Now what a hack actually does, it'll stop the seconds hand on a watch when you pull out the crown, which is a nice feature if you're trying to synchronize your watch with another watch. Now, let's take a look at this mainspring. Whoa, this mainspring barrel is full of grease. Ah, Ooh, uh-oh, wait a minute, it's getting away. Yeah, okay, all right. We all have our moments with mainsprings, and that was mine. It got away from me there. A little greasy, my tweezers couldn't hold on to it. Before I put the barrel inside of my cleaning machine, I want to get some of that heavy, heavy grease out of that barrel because it'll make my cleaning fluids last longer. I won't have to change them as much. So now I'm putting everything into these baskets, and then I'm going to put it in the cleaning machine. Now, the first stage is a wash, and then I put it into a rinse behind it there, and then behind that first rinse is another rinse. So the wash has actually got ammonia and a bunch of other chemicals in there. That's why I keep this out in my garage. The rinse is simple rubbing alcohol. After I got all the parts out of the cleaning machine, I noticed the mainspring had some issues. It's a little bent out of shape. So I ordered a new one off of eBay, which is a good place to pick up just about any parts you want for a watch. It's the holy grail for watch restoration. So before I put the mainspring into the barrel, I'm going to need to put some lubricant on it. And I'm going to use 8200. That's a Mobius product. I'm just going to put it on the inside of the barrel walls. Now, what that's going to do is let that barrel slip around as it winds or gets overwound. Now, with the new mainspring, whatever the color side is one you want to put up. If you put the other side up, it's backwards. To put the barrel arbor back in, I'm going to use this pin vise. I like it because it grabs the barrel arbor really, really tight, and I can get it in the right position. Then I'll put some more of that 8200 before I put the lid on the barrel. To make sure that the barrel lid is on snug, I use this little inexpensive two-piece plastic snap tool. Some of you that are watching, if you'd like to get into watchmaking, this is a great hobby, I'll tell you. It's something you can do on your desktop. You don't need a bunch of tools. You don't need a big, giant garage. It's just a simple, simple thing. I do mine in a back bedroom in my house. Now, I do keep my chemicals and things out in the garage. But other than that, it's a very minimal space you need to do this hobby. I actually got started with the hobby about 5 years ago when I was laying in a hospital bed for a week. I had a bad accident, and in the meantime, all I did was watch YouTube, and I found all these guys taking watches apart. And I go, I can do that. I love to take things apart, have since I was a child. With the train of wheels in place, now I can put back this funny-looking automatic winding wheel. And then I'll put on the main bridge. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on under there, so I'm going to take my time, make sure everything is in place and in their pivot before I screw it down. Once I get the screws in and get them semi-tightened down, I check to make sure everything is spinning correctly before I crank it all the way down. Because you crank those screws down without having a pivot in its jewel hole, you'll snap the end of that pivot off real fast. So you can see it's spinning very well. And here it is from the other side. You can see the escapement wheel spinning. Now I'm going to put in the part that actually engages with the oscillating wheel. This little thing will take the power from the oscillating wheel and bring it down to that funny little wheel that I was talking about earlier and get the power into the mainspring. It's kind of an ingenious way of doing it. Later on, models of Seikos use what they call the magic lever, but this was predated the magic lever. But it's a neat little system and it works pretty well. Now I'm putting on the ratchet spring and the ratchet, and what the spring actually does is it keeps the ratchet from, or the mainspring from unwinding after you put a wind in it. In other words, it just lets the ratchet go one way and not backwards. Then I'm going to put in the pallet fork. This has a funny looking pallet fork, doesn't it? And then the pallet fork bridge. So we're getting close to getting this thing fired up and seeing how it's going to do. But first, I got to go back over to the dial side of the watch. Now I'm putting in the clutch, and I put a little grease on there, And then here's your sliding pinion. This is all part of the keyless works. And then this will all attach to that unusual motion works that we're got to put into this watch. And that's where I think this problem's going to turn up. So with grease on the stem, and make sure everything's turning, put a little grease in the teeth, a little bit under the yoke. And what the yoke does is it pushes that pinion either forward or backwards. Forward would be for winding mode, backwards would be for setting the hands on the watch. Now this is the yoke spring. Seiko's got an unusual way of doing things. And this is a little cover plate that interacts with the setting lever. And here again, Seiko has unusual ways of doing things. And it's going to get this part in there. Nice and easy. Okay. Now, this is actually part of the motion works. This is the part, I guess you could call it the calendar works. It's like the two parts. When it engages, that little wheel on top will spin and turn the calendar date. Now that part on the right will go in and out when you push the stem in and out, and one part of it will engage with some motion works, and then it'll disengage the motion work as you pull it out. Now this little spring is actually the tension lever on the date wheel. You'll see it when I put the date wheel on. Now here's that spring that I was talking about that was out of whack. So I'm going to put that in there, get it nice and tight. See how it pushes against that little part with the two wheels on it? Then here's your actual setting lever. Now it goes up underneath this this plate that I put on earlier and had to take off. Here again, we'll get this nice and tight. And then there's a spring that I'm tightening down there that pushes on that. And then here is the setting lever spring. And that's what's supposed to hold that other spring that was out of whack. So now it's good and tight. So now we'll get this little cover plate in here. And this will keep the minute wheel and a lot of other pieces from falling out. This is actually the part of the watch that turns the date wheel. You see it interacts with that intermediate wheel there. And then this is actually the part that engages with the date wheel, that little tongue on there. So as the watch turns every 24 hours, that will flip the date wheel. But then there's also a part of this watch you can do with the quick set wheel. So now let's get the date wheel on here. You can get an idea of what I'm talking about. See those little teeth on the inside of the date wheel? They'll engage with the motion works part of the date wheel. So as I put one side of this cover plate on, I'm going to slide it over. Now there's that little spring I was talking about earlier. It holds the date wheel under tension, and then this cover plate holds the date wheel down. Now there's your quick set. You can see it working there. Now I've gone back on the other side of the watch. It's time to get it running. This is the balance wheel that I'm putting in here, and it's actually the heart of the watch. Now it's all cleaned up. I washed it separately. I don't know. Ooh, there it goes. Man, that was quick. It's an incredible sight once you get a watch ticking like this. Now, before I can put it all back together, I want to put some lubricant on the jewels on this balance wheel. Now, this is actually a little kiff spring, and this is an anti-shock mechanism. Seiko had their own design. That little brass spring holds the jewel, and then you can see it. It's very tiny. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put it in this solution called One Dip that will actually dissolve any dirt from old oil that was left on this jewel before. And there's the cap jewel. Now I'm going to put them back together. I'm going to flip it over because there is a dome side and a flat side on this cap jewel. Putting a tiny little bit of Mobius 9010 in the center of that jewel. Then I'm picking up the other side of the jewel that has the donut jewel in it and just drop it on there. They'll stick together because of the capillary action. Then I'm just going to drop it back in there. Now here's the tricky part, getting this little brass spring back in there. The shock springs actually protect the balance from getting broken when you drop the watch. Now I oiled the other side, and then also the jewels there on the top of that side of the movement. Now here's your dial. We're going to put it back on, tighten down the screws that hold the feet. And I have to push down on that little setting lever to get that back in there. Now I have to run the watch around so that I know it when it turned. Now this is actually that fine tuning screw that I almost forgot to put back in because it has to go in before you put it in the case. Now, before I put it back in the case, I'm going to drop this oscillating wheel back on there, put a little oil under there. You can see it moving as it turns. Tighten it down. Just make sure everything's working the way it's supposed to. Now, before I drop it back in, I need to put the hands back on. So here's my hour hand. Got to get that straight because now it's important when you have a watch with a date on it. You have to get the hours exactly at 12. That way, so when it hits 12 every day, it'll change the date. Otherwise, your date will be changing during any different part of the day. Anyway, here's your seconds hand. Now let's see if it's going to take off running. Come on, guy. Oh, wait a minute. This has got a hack. I got to push that thing in before it'll start running. So here we go. Push it in. The hack's engaging. Now, before I put it back into the case, I'm going to run the case through the ultrasonic machine. This is just some cleansing material in there with some water. It heats it up. You leave it run about 30 minutes. That's what the timer has on it. And when you're done, the parts are nice and clean. It gets in there and gets the yuck out of the cracks and crevices. Now, I'm dropping this back in there. This is kind of a touchy procedure. There we go. Get it in, get it in. There you go. Now, slide it. I got to slide it a little bit more. There we go. Now we can put the stem in. Now, let's see if we do it right. Yes, there goes the seconds hand. It's starting off. Now, this has got a little gasket around the movement. It just drops in there. You can see it. It just kind of a spacer, gasket, whatever we want to call it. Now, I'm going to put the crystal back on. This crystal is in good shape. I didn't have to go get a new one. It doesn't have very many scratches in it. It's got a nice gasket too. So I just kind of snug that gasket down. Check it again. Now, yep, everything's setting. And then if I push it in, yeah, it worked. Now, we got to put the bezel back on. So this is a crystal press, bezel installer, whatever you want to call it. And you can see there's a little tongue. I need to get that on this side of the watch so the next time I want to take that off, or somebody else does, they can get to it. Just going to kind of push it down with my hands. Then I'm going to tighten it down. But before I put it in there, I need to put some plastic on there because I don't want to scratch the bezel or the crystal when I'm doing this. Now this little press will push it down nice and even. Now you can try this by hand, but a press really makes a difference. As you can see, it's nice and snug. we go. Ah, beautiful. Running like a top. Okay, back on the time grapher. I think we did our job. That new mainspring, look at that. That amplitude, AMP, 297. Before, I think it was like 145, 160, somewhere in that range. Plus or minus 6 seconds a day. I can live with that. Now, here it is. It's nice and clean. Now, let me show you that. If I turn that, there's that quick set on the date that I was talking about. I'm actually in the second setting on that crown when you pull it out. Anyway, there's our finished product. It's looking really, really good. And I can't wait to put this on my arm and wear it proudly. And as always, thanks for coming along, and see you on the next one.